happened this week in Chicago, where justices on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments from Wisconsin and in Indiana. The justices asked Indiana's lawyer to explain why the state was, in their words, damaging the children of same-sex couples, asking them to struggle to grasp why the parents of their classmates could be married, but their parents cannot. For Indiana Solicitor General Thomas Fisher, the answers to every question seem to come down to tradition and biology.
I think the law goes as far as it reasonably can in defining marriage according to this theory of responsible procreation.
We don't allow incest, right?
We allow incest? We don't allow incest.
First cousin.
Oh, I'm sorry. Over 65. Yeah, I think there again the assumption being that there would be infertility at that stage. Now,
I don't think you're going to answer Judge Posner's question. So let me see if I can put it a little differently.
Later during oral arguments, Fisher was forced to again defend Indiana's idea of marriage.
I'm talking about the production of babies here. I'm talking about we don't know which couples are going to reproduce and which not. All we know is that opposite-sex couples can reproduce even if they don't intend to on the heat of the moment.
But you let all these sterile people marry.
But we don't know who they are. We don't know who they are, and we can't.
You know the cousins, right?
We can't inquire.
It's ridiculous, if you don't mind my saying so. Idea of these people models. So you have some 80-year-old cousins who've gotten married, and you say that's a model for family formation, will encourage young people to marry?
Well, I think that's part of it, and the other part.
Is there evidence about that model?
No, it's self-evident is the only thing.
I regard it as absurd. You say it's self-evident.
Well.
Right?
Boom. Here now to discuss the fight for marriage equality in Wisconsin and Indiana, as well as other states, is Chris Geidner, the legal editor for BuzzFeed, and Evan Wolfson, the founder and president of Freedom to Marry. Thank you both for being here. Chris, I'm going to start with you. You were in the court this week, and I wanted to know from you, how did the people react to the exchanges we just listened to?
It was something else, Jonathan. I've been attending all of these arguments across the country, and it was an environment unlike any that we've seen in any of these other cases. I mean, Judge Posner was just crushing each of the lawyers from the two states in their attempt to defend the bans. And then even when he wasn't doing it, the other two judges, you had the quote from Judge Williams, and then there was also Judge Hamilton who was hearing the case. Both of them were sort of the nicer version of the same sort of arguments that Judge Posner was giving, and the audience, which was largely supporters. I mean, there were two different cases that were multiple cases that had been combined in each state. So there were a bunch of plaintiffs in the room who were watching their case happening in front of these judges. And I think obviously going in, they were very nervous about what was going to happen. And then when we got into it, and within the first 5 minutes of the argument, it became sort of clear where the judges were going to be going, that it sort of the tone lightened, and people started sort of chuckling along as these questions got more and more brutal.
Hey, Evan, this summer we reached a milestone. Half of the states and Washington, D.C. now have couples who were married there. Could anyone have foreseen this in 2004 when anti-same-sex marriage campaigns were winning all over the country?
Yes, I think we could foresee it. We knew all along, and we had the strategy right from the get-go, that we were going to win by bringing the country to national resolution through a case in the Supreme Court. That the way to get there and to win was to build a critical mass of states and a critical mass of public support, conversation by conversation, persuasion by persuasion, and battle by battle. And what we're seeing now, what we're all feeling now, is that we have that critical mass of states. We have that critical mass of support. The American people, the American courts are ready to end this discrimination. And right now, we're at that point, as you said, a watershed that we have built to. And we have to keep doing what's been working in order to drive home the message now to the United States Supreme Court that not only is the country ready for the freedom to marry, but there's great urgency for them to act, for them to take a case or several cases and to end this discrimination, because every day of denial continues to be a day of real hardship and indignity for couples all across the country. It's time to end this discrimination.
Well, Chris, that leads to a question I was going to ask you next. You know, marriages are being prevented by a court order in 6 states where there are married same-sex couples. Can you give us any idea of how long people will have to wait?
Well, I mean,
first of all,
this is Chris. Go ahead.
I mean, that's the question that sort of that Evan was hinting at, is that we now have already several petitions before the justices of the Supreme Court asking them to take one of these cases. And this week we saw the unusual filings by plaintiffs, people who had won at the courts of appeals, saying, we want you to take these cases as well. And the justices are going to return from their summer recess in September next month, and they're going to have all of these cases before them. And I think Evan's point, the point that the states have made, the points that the same-sex couples have made, is that this is not something that the is going to be okay with the justices sort of holding off for another year or two. And I do think, I mean, despite what Evan said, I do think that the speed from Windsor to today is not at least what the justices were expecting.
Hey, Evan, I know you wanted to get in on that question. What's your answer?
Well, no, I do agree with what Chris said. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to Chris, who was just named Journalist of the Year by the National Journalists Association, the LGBT Journalists Association. Very well deserved.
NLGJA, yeah.
And it's because he's exactly right, that the courts are saying what the country has been saying. And the real question now to the Supreme Court is, having put a stay, having frozen several of the decisions that we have won in the nearly 40 decisions we have won over the past year, with courts all across the country saying there's no good reason for this discrimination. If you, the Supreme Court, are holding those cases, then you need to act, because the delay is really harming real families.
I'm not sure if we have enough time for me to ask you this question before we have to take the break. So, well, I'm going to ask you the question anyway. Here's a clip of Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, a Republican, after the courts overturning his state's ban on same-sex marriage last June. Take a listen.
I was one of the people that back in 2006 voted for the constitutional amendment, supported it then. My position hasn't changed. I just pointed out that right now it's ultimately left up to the courts. It's not a political matter anymore. It's ultimately in the courts, and I think the judge recognized that while she made a ruling, and I respect that, she also issued the stay because there are several other states where this issue is pending, and it'll ultimately be decided by a higher court.
So, Evan, there you have a 2016 presidential contender saying same-sex marriage is not a political matter anymore. That's pretty bold for a Republican of his stature to say, don't you think?
Well, actually, pretty reflective of the desire to get this over with and to not be on the wrong side of history that people like Scott Walker are evincing. And by the way, you played that clip of Judge Posner's withering dismissal of the anti-gay arguments that are being churned out again, sort of as a last-ditch measure by the justices, by the attorneys for the opposition. But Judge Posner in 1997 wrote an article in which he was reviewing a book advocating for the freedom to marry, and what he really said was, whether or not there's a constitutional right, and probably there is, it's unrealistic to expect the courts to get too far ahead of the public. It's unrealistic to expect the courts to do the heavy lifting. The country's not ready, he said in 1997. And here he was leading the charge now in court the other day, saying it's time for this discrimination to end. There is no good reason for it. So that's because we have created the climate that will now allow the courts, and now soon we hope the Supreme Court, to do what it should have done. I mean, the Constitution hasn't changed. The arguments haven't changed. What's changed is the understanding of how the denial of the freedom to marry really does hurt gay people and has no good reason.
Evan, Chris, stay with me. We're going to continue this discussion on the other side of the debate, other side of the break, including Justice Scalia and how he's helped this debate move along.